Thanks, Tara. It's a very good overview of the multi-species scorecard. As we saw, there's some commonality with the LIG scorecard from yesterday, and we'll have further elaboration, as Tara said, on the boundaries and aspects and specifications later on. We have two polls in relation to this presentation, so I'm just going to launch the first one at the moment, which you should see on your screens now. So what is the minimum number of legumes or herb species that should be included in a multi-species lay? Select either 2, 3, or 4. And this relates to question 1, obviously, on the multi-species lay scorecard. So hopefully we're all paying attention at the start of the presentation. Just give you a few more seconds. We have another poll coming up as well. Just a reminder that you can use the chat function for any questions you have or comments that you want to make on the presentations. So I'm just going to close the poll for the moment and share the results, which are 72% for the correct answer, which was number 3. So you need a minimum of 3 legume or herb species in a mix to qualify for the payment. So the second question on this, again, it relates to bonus points on this card for water courses, and we heard yesterday the importance of protecting water quality in critical source areas from Jenny Deacon. So the question here is, how, in the multi-species lay scorecard, how many bonus points are awarded for the fenced field margin beside a water course or drainage ditch? Please select 5, 10, or 15. So I'll just give another and a reminder again that all these presentations will be recorded and made available afterwards as well for people to watch back. So I'll just share the results of that poll for the moment. So again, it's the middle answer here. So 10 is the correct answer. 10 bonus points are awarded for the fenced field margin beside a water course or drainage ditch, which is equivalent to 1 full score on the scorecard. We saw yesterday that it's 5 marks for fenced margin beside a water course or drainage ditch on the LIG scorecard. So for the moment now, we're going to go straight into John and let John give his presentation on the research update on the multi-species swards. So I'll hand over to you now, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerome. Just bear with me one moment. Can you just confirm everything is okay there? Can you see a full screen presentation, Jerome?
Sorry, I can't see it yet. I can't see it yet, John.
Okay.
I can see you now, John, but I can't see the presentation yet. Yeah, that's it. It's up now on the cover slide there. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is John Finn. I'm a researcher based at Teagasc at Johnstown Castle in Wexford. I'm a researcher in farmland ecology, where I've been researching high nature value farming systems and the biodiversity and management of them. I've also been very interested in biodiversity restoration techniques in more intensively managed farming systems. And for a long time, I've also been looking at multi-species mixtures. So I want to thank the department for the invitation to just give a very short update on the kind of research that we've been doing on multi-species swards that are related to the kind of multi-species lays that are being put in as part of the REAP scheme. So what I'd like to just quickly cover today in a relatively short period of time is the relationship between mixture diversity and yields. So what is the effect of mixtures on yields? Also, what is the effect of mixtures on weeds? We get a lot of questions about how is weed control possible when you can't have a post-emergent spray. Want to look at their nitrogen replacement potential, and also a quick look at the role of mixtures in increasing resilience to drought. So at Johnstown, we've been looking at multi-species mixtures of various sorts for almost 20 years now, looking at grass legume work, which I'll show in a moment, but more recently looking at swards like this, which are 6 species mixtures under grazed conditions. There's a lot of research just starting in Ireland on multi-species mixtures as well, looking at things like silage quality, the biodiversity associated with mixtures, and so on. But what I'll cover this morning is a more restricted range of that, not being able to cover everything in one go. But maybe some of those topics will come up in the questions. So I want to start with an experiment that we had many years ago, based in a European project across Europe. And you can see across a wide range of sites, from very northern areas right down to the southern areas as far as Sardinia, we implemented the exact same mixture experiment. So we had a 4-species combination of 2 grasses and 2 legumes. And these were mixed in different proportions. So we had monocultures of each of the 4 species. We had the equiproportional mixture with 25% of each of the 4 species. But we also varied their evenness. So we had 70% of each of the species dominating and 10% of the others, and then 40% of 2 of those species dominating and 10% of the 2 others. So we're manipulating the evenness of the mixtures, comparing those to monocultures, and repeating this across 31 sites across Europe and a site in Canada as well. So at the time, there was quite an argument about whether mixtures were beneficial or not, especially as you went into moderate to more intensively managed systems with added nitrogen. And the feeling, it was quite a live debate at the time whether you would always be able to find a monoculture that was best suited to the prevailing conditions. Or alternatively, could you find a mixture that would be better suited because it was better utilizing light, it was better utilizing the resources in the soil, such as water or available soil mineralizable nitrogen. And then you could have positive interactions between legumes and grasses, which were quite well known at the time, but it was still quite a question whether they could be better than the best monoculture. So this is exactly the kind of question that this experiment was able to address. We used 4 species with 2 grasses and 2 legumes, and the grasses were a fast establishing grass, a slower establishing grass, a fast establishing red clover, and a slower establishing white clover. And this fast establishment was about getting plants up and germinated quickly and forming a good canopy to try and suppress weeds and weed biomass. And of course, the grass-legume interaction is quite obvious, where you get the symbiotically fixed nitrogen from the legumes benefiting the incorporation of nitrogen into the system, which also benefits the grasses. So we conducted these experiments, harvested them, and compared the results as follows. So each of the sites here is represented as the mixtures with these circles. The best performing monoculture is represented with this short bar, and the average of the 4 monocultures is represented by this square. And this configuration is repeated for each of the 31 sites across the whole experiment. So in this example here, you can see that the mixtures are better than the best monoculture and substantially better than the average of the 4 monocultures. So across the whole of the experiment, we see that the mixtures can be better than the best performing monoculture at each of these sites indicated with an asterisk. So at more than half the sites, and in general, mixtures performed better than the best monoculture, and they almost always perform better than the average of the 4 monocultures. So this is quite staggering, and we didn't expect this strength of effect of the mixtures compared to the best monoculture. Now you'll see a huge range in productivity across these European sites, reflecting very short, cold seasons at some of the sites, organic conditions at some of these sites here, and then some of the very dry sites with very low production down here. But one of the issues that this raises is that across a wide variety of soil types and climates, we see this consistent benefit of mixtures across this range of conditions. And people often say, well, I've got a slightly wetter soil, I've got a slightly drier soil, or my soil is this or that. And, you know, we take quite a bit of comfort that if we see mixture benefits across this extreme range of conditions, we're quite likely to see those consistent mixture benefits within a smaller geographical area such as Ireland. So just in summary, 98% of the almost 1,000 plots that we had across the experiment, 98% of those were better than the average monoculture, and 65% of those mixture plots were better than the best monoculture. And on average, the mixtures gave a 20% yield advantage over the best monoculture. So of course, yield isn't measured by, forage isn't measured by yield alone. We also want to know about the mixture quality, and one reflection of that is weed incidence. So in this graph here, which I'll explain in a moment, we're looking at weed incidence over different years. So this in each of these years, 1, year 2, year 3, we're comparing the weed incidence in the monocultures and in the mixtures across all of the sites. So we've got monoculture versus mixture in year 1, mono versus mix in year 2, mono versus mix in year 3. And the red bar here indicates what proportion of the total yield was comprised of weeds. So what we see in the monocultures is that over time, we see, again, quite a good establishment of the weeds in year 1, which increases to almost a third of the biomass by year 3. So what we find is that not only coupling this with the results from the previous graph, which showed that monocultures had lower biomass compared to the mixtures, that biomass was also comprised of a greater proportion of weeds than the mixtures. So in the mixtures, we had a consistent level of about 4% weeds that established in year 1, and by year 3, it still was at 4%. And this reflects an awful lot of research which shows that mixtures, once they establish well, are quite excellent at suppressing weeds. It's not a guarantee, and it's quite clear that if you've got a field with a known weed problem, then that needs to be addressed before you establish a multi-species mix or a lay. But once it's established, it has very good properties at suppressing weeds, probably because it's got excellent utilization of the canopy, and those little spaces where weeds might establish normally are taken up by the range of species, especially the herbs and the clovers. Another really key issue is nitrogen levels, and there's 2 points about this. So first of all, the inclusion of the legumes and clovers in the mix is represented here. So here we're manipulating, this is a site-specific experiment by Swiss colleagues that was part of the previous experiment as well. What they've done is they've done a manipulation of the legume proportion. So this point here represents the mixtures in which they had 100% grass, and this point here represents the mixtures in which they had 100% legume, and it's varying in between. So there's a 50-50 grass and legume here, 20% legume and 80% grass here. And they've also manipulated nitrogen levels. So they've applied 50 kgs of nitrogen per year, 150 kgs of nitrogen per year, and 450 kgs of nitrogen per year as a high nitrogen availability reference level. So this bar here, the red bar, indicates a grass-only mixture and its yield, total annual yield, when 450 kgs of nitrogen is applied per hectare. So that's quite a demanding reference point at which you'd expect nitrogen to be certainly not limiting. And what we can see here is at the 50N level, by manipulating the clover proportion, you can see that as clover becomes greater in the sward, up to about 30 to 40% here, with 50 kgs of nitrogen and about 40% of clover in the sward, you can see that those yields are exceeding those gained from the 450 kgs of nitrogen on the grass-only mix. That effect, the relative benefit declines as you increase the nitrogen level, but again, at nitrogen 150, you can see as you go up to about, again, 20% here, you can see that the benefit of the clover manipulation kicks in and it's beating the 450 kgs of nitrogen. So there is, if you get it right, there is a really strong nitrogen replacement potential to be gained from the mixtures, which has quite serious implications, of course, at a time when Irish agriculture and all agriculture is trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and especially the nitrous oxides that are associated with the application of inorganic nitrogen. Second really important point that this experiment showed is that I don't show it here, but I can talk about it, is that the application of higher levels of nitrogen was associated with a very rapid disappearance or reduced persistency of the clovers and the sward over time. So it's quite clear, and this is evident from a lot of research, that if you want the multiple species to persist, the best way of doing so is to have as low a nitrogen level as possible. So there's very good persistence of those species with 50 kgs of nitrogen, and extremely poor persistence of those species after 3 years with 450 kgs of nitrogen, and intermediate at 150. But the clear lesson is that the lower the nitrogen level, the greater the persistence of the species. So in recent years, one of the questions that we've been really interested in is, can mixtures provide insurance against drought? You know, in the ecological literature and in science, there's often an assumption that diversity is better to withstand shocks and environmental disturbances. And it's actually quite surprising how little scientific research there is to test that idea in ecology and agricultural ecology. So this is a site where we were testing this idea by implementing multi-species mixes of different diversity levels and imposing an experimental drought. And I remember when we first proposed this experiment to a group back, you know, many years ago. I was introducing the experiment; it was just getting underway, and you know, there was quite a laugh about the idea that Irish agriculture should be concerned about drought. But of course, the year that we established this was 2018, and this is what this site looked like around June in 2018 below Wexford. We had these experimental drought shelters being imposed on the site with a real drought all around us, to the extent that we had to irrigate the so-called rain-fed treatment to maintain the difference between drought and rain-fed. Anyway, just moving back to the experiment, we were manipulating grasses, legumes, and herbs in a particular design, again, manipulating the evenness of them, so that we had monocultures of grasses, monocultures of legumes, monocultures of herbs. We had 50-50 points of each of those, so 50-50 of grass, legume, grass herb, legume herb, and then a mix in the middle of all three of them with different evennesses. We don't need to worry too much about that right now. So it's a mix of grasses, mixing the proportions with clovers, 2 clovers, and mixing the proportion with herbs. So we had red and white clover, we had chicory and plantain, and we had the grasses. And the idea behind it was that by including deep rooting red clover and the deep rooting plantain and chicory, we're able to access deeper soil levels of where moisture would be more available. We're also using the purported nitrification inhibiting effects of the plantain. And then we're also trying to benefit from the known contribution of symbiotically fixed nitrogen that should be able to benefit both the grasses and the herbs. So there's a lot of interactions going on here that could benefit the mixtures. And then we're also interested to see, does that benefit occur under drought as such? So this is what those plots and the drought manipulation look like on the ground. We harvested them, sorted the species, and this is a flavor of the results. I'll just talk through this because it's not immediately obvious. So what we've got here is that same design I showed a minute ago, where you've got the 2 legumes represented as a legume group here, a legume monoculture. You've got a grass monoculture, which is 2 species of grass here, and you've got the herb monoculture with the chicory and the plantain represented here. And these density plots show the more green the color, the yields. So you can see this range of yields going from about 8.5 tons up to 12.5 tons. This is total annual yield averaged over 2 years. And these are plots all at 150 kgs of nitrogen per hectare. So you can clearly see that as you go towards the center point here, you get this really strong gradient of an increase in yield as the 6 species are mixed, or here as the 3 functional groups of grass, legume, and herb are mixed. So there's a very clear mixture effect. What's really interesting is that you see the exact same effect under drought. So overall, the colors are lighter, reflecting the effect overall of drought on yield, as you'd expect. But the mixtures have an even greater effect here, showing that you have the sweet spot in the middle where all 3 of the functional groups or all 6 species are mixing. That's where you get the greatest benefit in resilience against yield. So the center point here, where all 6 species are equally represented, was producing almost 12 tons. The center point in the drought was producing almost just over 10.5 tons, again reflecting that effect of drought on yields. And in both cases, at the high reference level, we had an inclusion of plots with 300 kgs of nitrogen on Lolium perenne. So in both cases, the mixtures were able to exceed or equal with 150 kgs of nitrogen the yields from Lolium perenne with 300 kgs of nitrogen. So we're getting more yield from less nitrogen, from half the nitrogen to be exact. And we're seeing that the benefits of mixtures that are observed under normal rain-fed conditions are also observed under drought. Okay, I'll just move on very quickly. Just the last few slides, Jerome. So we're also looking at this in this work at greenhouse gas emissions from the mixtures, and we're specifically looking at nitrous oxide emissions. So here we're looking at these at plot scale only, so it's not a full life cycle analysis. But measuring the nitrous oxide emissions from the plots, we see here quite high levels of emissions from the perennial ryegrass with 300 kgs of nitrogen, lower levels of emissions intensity, I should say, from the perennial ryegrass with 150 kgs of nitrogen, and the lowest levels from that 6 species mixture where they're all mixed equally with 150 kgs of nitrogen. So this is emissions intensity. So that's the absolute amount of nitrous oxide emissions expressed as the amount of yield. So it's nitrogen oxide emissions per ton of yield in this case. Again, we can see, a very clear effect of mixtures on the emissions intensity of nitrous oxide. So looking to the next steps, we and others, such as colleagues in UCD, are putting multi-species mixtures under grazing trials. We're also looking at new experiments at soil fertility effects and soil carbon sequestration. And with the increase in interest about anaerobic digestion, we're also very interested in looking at low or zero nitrogen multi-species mixtures to provide the grass forage for anaerobic digestion, if that is to be sustainability compliant or sustainability accredited, because we can't have that input of inorganic nitrogen fertilizer and the associated greenhouse gas emissions if we are to have sustainability accredited anaerobic digestion. Okay, I'll leave it at that for the moment. If anybody's interested, there is more information on our work on mixtures at this site here. And thank you again for your attention.
Thanks very much, John, and some very interesting results coming there. Obviously, a lot done and more to do, as use that phrase. There are lots of questions coming in for both presentations, so I'll just try and highlight a few of them. One of them, I suppose, is coming up on the MSL one is seed rates itself. Now, we haven't, because it's a results-based action, we actually haven't complicated things by looking at seed rates or specifying any particular mixes. So whatever commercial mixes are out there, it's generally sown at the 12-13 kgs per hectare. They're sown in sold by acre packs, and we accept those. We haven't specified any particular percentages or proportions which the legumes or herbs have to be. I don't know, John, if you want to comment on the research side, what type of seed rates or mixes you have used, or have you any experiences on that?
Yeah, we first of all, the seed weight per acre throws me straight away. We would usually express them as per hectares, but because we're combining them for experiments, what we usually do is take the seed rate in monoculture. So you have a seed rate in monoculture for Lolium, Timothy, chicory, plantain, and the clovers and so on. What would you, if you were to work that as a monoculture, what would be the kilograms per hectare? And then if we're aiming for 1/6 of each of 6 species, we divide that monoculture rate by 6 and put that together in a mix. So that's how we do it for experimental purposes. On the farm, when we do all of that and work it up, it's working out at, 25 to 28 kilos per hectare, which probably isn't that far off of what you mentioned in the per acre numbers a moment ago, Jerome. But it is clear that the seeding rate is, and the proportions is quite important, because you want enough of the herbs and the clovers to get enough establishment to get those maximum points and the maximum payment. But also, I suppose the farmers will be grazing or using this forage as well. So you don't want so much, that you want to make sure that some grass is in there as well. Our work would be showing that aiming for 50 to 60% of grasses in the sward would be a good target, and the rest is comprised of the clovers and the herbs. And they're all contributing. That's the other thing that's important from that research. The herbs are contributing to the beneficial interactions, but they're also contributing to the forage quality and the forage quantity, and the same with the clover. So it's not a direct trade-off with the grasses, but to get the benefit of the interactions amongst them, you'd be aiming for about 50% of the grasses, maybe 25% of the herbs, and 25% clovers. But again, when you sow it, you don't have so much control over what pops up, and you can put the exact same mix out on 10 different fields and get variations on what establishes, which is one of the benefits of the mixes. It responds to the local soil condition.
Yeah, thanks, John. And Tara, maybe a question for you at the moment. I suppose just to explain again the difference between Lig and multi-species, and what's the advice about when to use each? Sorry, Tara, can you hear us?
No, I didn't. Sorry. Can you repeat, please?
Sorry, Tara. What's the difference between Lig and multi-species, and when do you use either? So just to reiterate that, explain the
difference.
Explain the advice around what field, where Lig and multi-species, yes, where they're suitable. They're very different targets.
They're very different, yeah. Well, I mean, low input grassland scorecard is you're not planting anything. We're paying for results-based payments based on the quality, the biodiversity quality of an existing old permanent pasture, and the older and the less nutrients and the less fertilization that's received, well, then the higher the scores that will be received on that, because the more plants are likely to be there, and the more plants that are there, then that's they're a surrogate for, which show that there's higher levels of biodiversity in that field, of all types of biodiversity. The multi-species lays are designed because we recognized and we were cognizant, and we didn't want to exclude any types of farmers from REAP. So we were aware that a lot of more intensive farmers, dairy farmers, and other intensive beef farmers may not have suitable fields for low input grassland if they have been heavily managing every one of their fields and they don't have any that are low input. So for a field that the MSL is suited for fields that intensive farms where you normally carry out a reseed, and people, the reseed is typically carried out every 7 years. So that's the field types to be used for multi-species lays. It's a field where you are typically undergoing planning to do a reseed anyway as part of your normal farming operations. But rather than reseeding with ryegrass, that you're choosing to put in one of these mixes instead, and receiving some environmental payments and environmental rewards for doing so.
Thanks, Tara. I think it's also worth pointing out, I suppose, that the Lig scorecard pays much higher, yeah, in those scenarios as well. So there's no comparison from an economic perspective. It just doesn't make any sense to put in multi-species lay where it's not appropriate anyway. John, there's a few questions that I'm sure they've come up before around sort of the impact of poaching and animal health effects. Is there anything you can say from the research side on those topics? Any comments from your experience?
Our experience so far is that there's no issues. Our or certainly no obvious issues. From the animal health perspective is very important, and there's absolutely no indication of any problem. If anything, you know, the animals seem to thrive on it. We've started animal experiments, grazing experiments with the multi-species at Johnstown, and you know, it's very, very early days, and I wouldn't like to say it's not a conclusion, but the early indications are that they're performing more or less neck and neck, with a lot less nitrogen being applied to the multi-species mixture compared to a grass-dominated mixture with higher nitrogen. So there's no milk performance is tracking very well. Milk quantity and milk quality is tracking well. There's no animal health issues. I guess the one animal health issue that you might be concerned about is bloat, but that's the normal bloat recommendations and watching out for fields or pastures that might have a very high or too high an amount of clover in it. Animals going on to it, you know, suddenly introducing clover or legumes into the diet. I think that's probably the single biggest animal health issue to worry about. But that's a normal clover, if you call it normal. It's a normal clover issue rather than being anything associated with multi-species mixtures. Other than that, there's nothing to be concerned about. And I should say, it's not just Irish research. I mean, there's been a lot of research on multi-species mixtures on the continent over the years, and in some countries they're just a standard part of farming practice, especially in areas that are harder hit with climatic conditions than ourselves.
Okay, thanks, John. There's a comment here again on the longevity of the sward, and I think you touched on this in relation to nitrogen use, and it's one of the things, again, we have to be very clear about the results-based approach that we have. We don't have any stipulation about nitrogen per se, but what we want to do and what we strongly advise is that farmers reduce their nitrogen drastically to allow the sward to develop. I suppose you've kind of covered that as well, John. Do you want to make any other comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that the higher the nitrogen level, the lower the persistency, especially of the clovers. And I suppose also you know, we're still looking at ways of, we're still trying to ascertain what is the level of persistency, because you hear some farmers who have absolutely no problems with persistency of the species over time, and other farms that do. It's probably related to soil fertility or soil nitrogen application, but it is one of the areas that we need a stronger insight into. But the evidence so far clearly shows that the higher the nitrogen, the lower the persistency. On the flip side, I mean, as a farmer going into a results-based approach, I think it does open up, you know, if you do have issues with persistency, it's quite clear that you should be doing something about it, such as oversowing or you know, stitching in seed, and that's a way to try and rectify it.
Yeah, thanks, John. There's a few comments on the use of pesticides as well, and I think, John, you touched on this as well. And again, from the results-based perspective, we're looking at what's in the field and looking at the indicators. We have no specific requirements regarding pesticides. But obviously, if you use pesticides or broadcast, you're going to seriously impact on what your field is going to score in either LIG or MSL. So spot treatment of noxious weeds would be recommended where present. But I think one of the key points you made, John, was that you need to get weed control under early prior to establishment, and that's one of the key issues.
Yeah, I think the common concern is that, I mean, you do not apply, there is no post-emergent spray that you could put onto a multi-species sward that is herb safe and clover safe and grass safe. There's just no product that will do that for you. So, but that's why I focused on that slide, which showed if you can get good establishment of the multi-species mix, it's excellent at suppressing the normal weeds that you come across. I mean, we did this in Johnstown, and we don't have any weed problems. And most farmers have no weed problems after good establishment of the multi-species mix. They just inherently, across study after study, are excellent at suppressing weeds once you get a good establishment.
Yeah, thanks, John. Just a question, I suppose, on the first presentation as well about the management advice. You know, it's very much about targeted towards helping farmers improve their scores in year 2. So it's not something that is controlled in the sense of it's up to the farmer to either take that advice on board or not. It's recommendations basically at the end of the scorecard if the farmer wants to improve his score. There are some questions on margin management as well, and widths of margins. What we're saying clearly is that we recommend to remove these cuttings from the margins. If where practical, obviously it can be more challenging if there's only a 1 metre margin, but we'd encourage farmers to put in wider margins where possible. And we are only looking for temporary fences because it's a short-term project as well. So fences can be removed if people want to bale or otherwise remove the cuttings if it's in the way. It's just to clarify that. I think that's pretty much it for now on multi-species. There are a few other questions, but which will be covered in later presentations as well on the specifications and boundaries. So we'll come back to those later. Thanks very much, John, again for helping us out this morning. I think it's very interesting what the research has done and the emerging research. It's a growth area. There's a lot of farmers interested in this, but obviously there's more work to do. But I think the work on the farms and trialing on farms will actually help as well to feed back into that research as to how things work on the ground as opposed to specific trial plots, etc. So thanks very much, John, and we'll move on now back to Cara for the next presentation on field boundary assessments.